So there's one example of how China is alleviating pressure on cities like Beijing. For more on the world's urban growth, let's bring in Uwe Brandes. He's Associate Professor at Georgetown University here in Washington. Uwe, thank you for coming in. We saw that piece there talking about building these sub-centres. A lot of the time we talk about the urbanization of society. We know now that we're becoming a predominantly urban society with those demographics. And yet the United Nations says 55% of the world's poor live in rural areas. That would suggest should we be doing a little more to try and rather than doing on cities?
Well, I think it's a great question. So let's just back and understand the dynamics here. We are in the middle of a totally unprecedented wave of global urbanization. So we are about halfway through this wave. We've started about 50 years now. We have about another 40 years or so to go. As the report noted, we have about half of the people in the world living in cities. And in only just a few decades, we'll have 2/3. So people are voting with their feet. They're moving from the countryside into the cities. Cities are getting bigger, and the pace of change is happening at a much faster pace than we've ever experienced before.
And is it too much? Because you read all the time about the pressures on cities to try and simply keep up with this kind of thing, not just in the developing world, but
everywhere.
All over the world.
So virtually every society is getting more urban. Some are very urban already. In the United States, we're moving from about 82% to about 90% urban. But back to your question, I think it's a fair question. What is happening to people in more rural areas? And I think the key to answering that is to really understand the economic relationships between cities and the lands around them. Cities consume 75% of the world's natural resources, so they're economic drivers, 80% of the global GDP. The solution to rural areas also lies in cities and better relationship between urban areas and agricultural and rural areas.
When you say that, do you mean things like public transport services to help people from rural areas come into the city? Or?
Absolutely, and also economic cooperation, thinking about food systems, thinking about different kinds of rural economies and the way in which they support and can benefit from urbanization themselves.
But people will always want to move to cities. Is there any argument for saying, well, we need to make rural areas more attractive to stop that and ease the pressure on cities? But the fact is people always want to move to cities for job opportunities. We're in the capital of the US talking now.
Well, I think one of the other shifts we see is the change from single cities to larger metropolitan regions. So it's a new paradigm for thinking about urbanization. The report showed the Beijing region. The Beijing region is actually a global leader in thinking about itself as a metropolitan region and not just as a single city. And in that paradigm, there are more opportunities for more highly refined and highly developed local economies serving urban centers.
Who does this sort of thing best? And I ask that, is it the role of governments to manage these problems, or is it companies? And I'm thinking here of a company like Google, which is going to have its second headquarters here in the United States, bids from cities right across the US. There's lots of tax incentives at stake from governments trying to lure them. But why doesn't Google move to somewhere like rural Iowa and create thousands of jobs there and keep people in those rural areas? Why shouldn't it do that? And why can't governments perhaps do more to encourage that kind of thing?
Well, I think you look at it from the perspective of a private employer. Companies want to locate where their workers are happiest, and often the livability of cities trumps other locations. And so we see large innovation economies emerging in highly urbanized areas, and naturally companies want to move and be part of that. But there's also a second component to this, and that is that it's not just government or just business or civil society. It's really the combination. I mean, one of the incredible things about cities is that it's not just one entity that creates a city, although at the end of the day, in most cities around the world, it is indeed the private sector that invests and builds cities.
Very quickly, Uwe, one theory is that with this concentration of people in cities, particularly regenerating downtown areas in inner cities, that suburbs are going to be the next place to be abandoned effectively. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that is a concern, and we see shifts from people living in cities out to suburbs, and then that shift reversing in the recent decades. Really, it represents an opportunity to build regional transit systems and create new housing opportunities in suburban areas at a lower price point that many people can afford.
Yeah, that's always it, the affordability of living in cities. Professor Uwe Brandes, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.